Where did it all start? How did I get here? Why do I have to pay taxes? Why must I live under late-stage capitalism? Why has the world been created for humans in a way that doesn't support or sustain us? Who knows? Not me. But I have theories. And they involve archaeology. Hey, how you going? I'm an archaeology student and I use the time you have so graciously given me to talk about archaeology things, because that's all I know how to talk about. We were put on this earth with the sole purpose of staying alive, and now I have to pay to drink water. I like to trace this all back to the development of what we now call society, which usually takes us back around 12,000 years ago, which is when we start to see the first ever sedentary human societies. A cradle of civilization is a location and a culture which kind of emerges without influence of any other culture and develops its own civilization. So what do we mean when we talk about the term civilization? Our understanding of the word civilization has meant different things to us throughout history. Until the 19th century, these damn scholars again believed that civilization began in Europe, specifically Greece and Rome. Then a very small but revolutionary group posited a new idea that civilization as we know it actually began in the Middle East. Anthropologists and archaeologists still can't really decide today on what civilization means. Archaeologists love to rock the boat. But one common definition describes it as a complex society of cities. The word civilization coming itself from the Latin word civitas, which means city. A city has a sedentary non-nomadic population, monumental architecture, the existence of social classes and a social hierarchy, and oftentimes the creation of a writing system for communication. Where have these cradles been found? Scholars usually acknowledge 6 different cradles of civilization around the world. There's Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient India, and ancient China, as well as the Caral Supe civilization in Peru and the Olmec civilization in Mexico. All of these cradles depended on agriculture for their sustenance and their sustainability, except possibly Caral Supe, but we're not talking about her today. It's now common belief that urbanization or the formation of these cities began in the Fertile Crescent. It's time to talk about Mesopotamia. No one was doing it like her. Mesopotamia was an ancient region which encompassed what we now call Iraq, Syria, and Iran, as well as bordering on Turkey. The convergence of the Tigris and Euphrates River in this area created fertile soil and enough water supply for irrigation. And we see Neolithic cultures emerge here from as early as 8000 BC. This is what we call the Neolithic Revolution, and it changed lives. Don't believe me? Why not? Are you an archaeologist? The Neolithic Revolution was the critical transition which resulted in the birth of agriculture, which took Homo sapiens from being mostly a hunter-gathering species into one that was able to create its own regulations around food, i.e. agriculture. Most archaeologists, myself included, think that this was mainly driven by environmental changes. Isn't everything? As the last glacial maximum was ending and temperatures were getting warmer, it allowed people to begin cultivating plants and herding animals. The first actually sedentary culture that we know of is the Natufian culture, which was located in the Levant. And this is actually a little bit of a peculiar one. These weren't a nomadic people, they were a sedentary culture. However, they were still hunter-gatherers, which is this really interesting in-between, which I guess is often overlooked because we kind of think of hunter-gatherers, foragers, and then we think of like sedentary agriculture as being two vastly separate things, and they are, it's very different, but it is possible to have a bit of both. The Natufians didn't have agriculture, they did have a lot of other characteristics of what we would call a civilization. Unfortunately, they ran into a bit of tough times because the world might have had a mini ice age for a while. Another video. What the Natufian settlement in the Levant suggests to us is that settlement came first and farming came as a result of that, as opposed to the other way around. People didn't farm and then decide to settle in the farms. People settled and then decided to farm, at least in this specific location. There have been many theories postulated over the years as to why the hell humans gave up what was generally a less energy exerting lifestyle to a more rigorous one. Now, hold the phone. Because you might think that humans evolved and left behind like the dangerous ways of foraging and hunter-gathering. That's not necessarily the truth. There's no evidence that humans 10,000 years ago were any smarter than we are. They're the same physical humans that we are now, right? They just had a different outlook on the world. Foragers knew how to live in nature, and their life depended on the knowledge of the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. In a sense, the agricultural lifestyle is a much less satisfying one than that of a hunter-gatherer. Yes, maybe you do end up getting more food overall for the entire population, but the average farmer would work from sunrise till sunset, and the average forager would work, I don't know, until they killed a bison, then they could just fuck around for the rest of the day and do whatever they wanted. Plus, the diet of a hunter-gatherer would have been a lot more nutritiously diverse and satisfying than wheat. The surplus of food that was being acquired did not translate into more free time for the average person. Instead, what it did was create a group of people who worked all day and a group of people who just sat on their ass. social hierarchy. I was reading Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, and he brought up a wonderful point that we usually think of humans as domesticating plants, but you can also think about it the other way around. Let's take wheat as an example. Before agriculture, wheat was just some random plant chilling in some parts of the Middle East. It wasn't very special. Then all of a sudden, over millennia, it's growing all over the place. There's wheat in all parts of the world that it never would have ordinarily have grown in. All right, so picture this. We've got early modern humans. They're just vibing. They're having a chill time. They look at some wheat. They look at it for a while and like, I could probably eat that. They did that with a lot of things. It's not hard to imagine. But they plucked it and then they realized they could actually do quite a lot with it. But it was a bit of a little bitch. It didn't appreciate pebbles and rocks in its soil, so humans cleared the way for it to grow uninterrupted. It didn't appreciate other plants growing near it, so humans picked out the other plants and cultivated wheat farms. Humans were domesticated by the specific needs of a specific plant, which led them to working hours and hours under the sun to make that plant happy so it would grow more. Okay, good for them. Well, not really, because human bodies weren't made to cultivate wheat. Human bodies hadn't evolved for millions and millions of years to be crouching down and pulling plants from the earth. They had evolved to climb trees and run after animals and other shit. I don't know. We don't do it anymore. Now humans have to deal with back pain, arthritis, bad posture. Our bodies are doing things they were never meant to be doing. Anyway, now people have all of this wheat, and they have farms which are growing more and more and which will continue to grow more year upon year. So they can't just leave. They have to create a permanent place to stay and tend to the wheat. Homes, settlement, sedentary culture. Why do we do this though? Why do we decide to rely on a couple grains and totally homogenize our intake? Sounds dangerous. What if it rained a lot? All the crops are doomed. Where's the nutritional diversity? This was the beginning of the end for humanity, TBH. There are a few theories as to why people did this, why they went from less energy-consuming foraging to more structured farming. There are lots of theories. I'm going to go through three because I can't really be bothered to do them all. First, there's the oasis theory, which was proposed by Raphael Pumpelly in the early 1900s. So that tells you all you need to know about its relevance. So this theory basically maintains that as the climate got drier, communities contracted into little oases where they were forced into close association with animals. They domesticated animals along with planting seeds. All right, Pumpelly, why don't you go sit down? This theory doesn't really hold much weight with archaeologists because current climate data suggests that Mesopotamia was getting wetter rather than drier. So he kind of just made that shit up. And there's the feasting model, which is by Brian Hayden, which I think is really interesting. I don't know if I believe this. I don't not believe it. Essentially, he suggests that agriculture was driven by the need to ostentatiously display your power, such as giving feasts to assert your dominance. Essentially, someone rich would be like, I'm so rich, I can feed all of you. And so they would hold big feasts. This required being able to assemble large quantities of food, which drove agricultural technology. Interesting, I wouldn't have thought of that myself, Mr. Hayden. And then we have the demographic theories proposed by Carl Sawyer and Louis Binford, which essentially states that populations were growing at such a rapid pace. Hunter-gathering just wasn't really able to feed the population, and so they needed to develop technology to feed the growing population. All of these are probably true, except the first one, along with other things. Honestly, we'll never know. But it's my job to figure it out anyway. Either way, humans decided to stay put. And by 8000 BC, we had some of our first sedentary populations in Mesopotamia, which included the ancient countries of the Fertile Crescent, like Sumer, Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, and Phoenicia. These are regarded as the world's earliest complex societies. Let's talk about them. Start with Sumer, which is the earliest known civilization of all time, and began to form as early as the 5th or 6th millennium BC. Sumerians are credited with some of the most fundamental inventions of human history. The wheel, large-scale architecture, the writing system. In the late 4th millennium BC, Sumer was divided into a whole bunch of little city-states, and each was centered on a temple which was dedicated to a specific patron deity. These cities were likely theocratic and were headed by a priest king, and then were ruled by a priest governor, who was intimately tied to the religious rituals and rites that would happen in the city. The two most important cities of Sumer were Uruk and Ur. There are lots of periods within the Sumer civilization. You don't need to know them, but they're here for you. We start with the Ubaid and Uruk periods, and this is when the city-states rose to power. The Sumerians really had a good thing going. They essentially invented time, because they actually divided the day and night into 12-hour periods, then hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds. Also, if you're wondering how old the civilization is, relatively, you all know how old the pyramids are, right? Cleopatra lived closer to, the invention of the iPhone to the construction of the pyramids. Well, the Sumerians date back 2,000 years prior to the pyramids being built, just to put it into some perspective. We also get the first heroic epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, absolute king. And the Sumerians, having essentially invented the idea of a city, created the oldest city in the world, which is Uruk. Although the city that was most important to the Sumerians and that which they viewed as the oldest city was one called Eridu. This was presided over by their god of wisdom and water, Enki, who allegedly raised it from the marshes and established the concept of kingship and order over the land. The establishment of the city of Eridu by Enki was seen as like this golden age by the Sumerians, like equivalent to the Garden of Eden. Okay, what's really cool is a little something we have called the Sumerian king list. The Sumerian king list documents all of the rulers of Sumer, which was composed in 2100 BC and went all the way back, detailing all the rulers all the way back to the beginning of the world, when the gods first established kingship in Eridu. And the first king who is archaeologically mentioned in this king list, so essentially the first king ever, the first king that we have the name of, the king who started it all, was named Etana and was described as he who stabilized all the lands. The list then goes on like chronologically, sometimes with like impossibly long dates for rulers to be ruling, so I guess take it with a grain of salt if you want. Sumer expanded quite rapidly, and during the Uruk period, the culture had spread really widely, and they needed the invention of some kind of system to be able to communicate over long distances. This culminated in the invention of writing, the written word, which took place like circa 3600 BC. Early writing, essentially they just needed it for like long distance trade, long distance communication. It would detail simple things. So it'd be something like 2 goats, 5 sheep, Kish. Easy enough for the sender to send, but then the recipient would be left wondering whether the 2 goats and 5 sheep would be coming from the city of Kish, whether they would be leaving from the city of Kish, and why were the goats coming, and with what payment. Were they even alive? Were they dead? Like, they needed more. The system of writing would develop drastically by the early dynastic period. So much so that they will be able to produce incredible works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like a full-on epic poem. So I would say they've stepped up a little bit from 2 goats, 5 sheep. In cuneiform, which was this earlier system of writing, a carefully cut little wedge known as a stylus was pressed into soft clay to produce like wedge-like imprints in the clay that represented word signs. So it was a pictographic language. And then later phonograms or word concepts, which is more similar to languages we have today, were used instead. All of the great Mesopotamian civilizations used cuneiform till it was abandoned in favor of the alphabetic script in around like 100 BC. To summarize, the city-states of Sumer were like small independent countries, and they often fought over land and water rights. They never really united into one group. They were just kind of like independently managing. Unfortunately, this kind of lack of unity left them open to attacks by stronger groups. Cast your mind back to 2300 BC. You can't? Well, I'll tell you what happened then. In 2300 BC, the Akkadians took over the land. So the Akkadians came from northern Mesopotamia, and they were led by a great king named Sargon. He kind of slays, I'm not gonna lie. And he became the first ruler of the Akkadian Empire. He built his empire through having like really efficient military strategies. First, he assembled a large army, then he taught his soldiers how to fight in tight formation, which like hadn't really been done before in humanity's history. Like the Sumerian city-states would often kind of fight with each other and potentially like, you know, have warfare with each other, but Sargon kind of like militarized in a way that nowhere had been militarized in the past before. And they continued to conquer great parts of Mesopotamia and become essentially the world's first empire. After defeating the king of the city-state of Uruk, Sargon had gained control of all of Mesopotamia, including Sumer. To keep control of his empire, he actually implemented some very smart political strategies. He destroyed the walls of the cities to make it harder for people to rebel. He also demanded the loyalty of the governors of the city-states. If they were disloyal, then Sargon would just replace them with his own men. And he became the first king to decree his son's rule after him, so essentially establishing the law of kinship. Despite the Akkadians essentially having conquered Sumer, the Sumerian culture lived on. Akkadians farmed using the Sumerian irrigation techniques. To record information, they used Sumerian writing. Independently of the Sumerians, the Akkadians did become very skillful in art, and they became especially known for their 3-dimensional sculptures, as well as carving relief sculptures on stones, or steles. The victory stele is a very famous example. It was created to celebrate a victory by Sargon's grandson, King Naram Sin. The stele shows the victorious Naram Sin leading his army up a slope, with some of his enemies being crushed underfoot. Future Mesopotamian states, which I won't talk about today because we're kind of leaving the realm of the Fertile Crescent and the rise of civilization, would often relate themselves back to the Akkadian Empire, which they saw as like the classical standard in terms of governance and what an empire should be. The Empire of Akkad collapsed in 2154 BC, not really that long after it started, but it does hold an incredibly historic precedent for being the first ever empire, and Sargon for being the first ruler to really expand his territory in a substantial way. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire ushered in a bit of a Dark Ages period for this region in Mesopotamia, which lasted until the rise of the third dynasty of Ur in 2112 BC. But I think I'm going to stop it there because this video is about like the beginning of civilization, and once we get past Sumer and Akkad, I mean, civilization has well and truly begun. So I don't think there's any more to say on that front. If you want to know more about Mesopotamia and what happened following the Akkadian Empire, let me know and I'll do like a follow-up video, I guess. But yeah, that was the rise of civilizations, how humans went from being a hunter-gathering species to a mostly agricultural one. Also, if you're still here, I just came back from a trip to Greece, which was really cool and exciting. I was doing lots of archaeology things, so I'm going to have a lot of potentially Greek content coming out. I know people tend to prefer the kind of prehistory stuff, but I specialize in ancient and classical Greek archaeology, so you're gonna have to deal with it. Okay, bye, love you.